A great showing, great attendance. My name is Chris Faricy, and I have the privilege of being the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, along with the Hicker Family Professor of Renewing Democratic Community. Today's event is part of the Tanner Lecture Series on ethics, citizenship, and public responsibility. Endowed by Dr. W. Lynn Tanner, the Tanner Lecture Series invites leaders in their fields who have demonstrated through their life and work that generative efforts can enrich both our public and private lives. The lecture aims to stimulate audiences to re-envision their own civic responsibilities and to not merely inform, but to also engage and provoke, which I think today's conversation will, and also to leave a lasting impression that influences future behavior. We would like to thank Dr. Tanner and his family for their generous support to this lecture series and to the Maxwell School. I would also like to thank the Campbell staff, Jackie Nicheski and Kelly Coleman, who, through their tireless work, make events like this possible. And also to the Dean's Office for their continued support for not only the Institute, but this speaker series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. I want to bring your attention to a recent survey that was done of over 500 political scientists and 2,000 citizens. And what this survey found is that the vast majority of respondents, both the experts and people in the public, categorized the United States as moving swiftly from representative democracy to some form of authoritarianism. In the benchmark survey, known as the Bright Line Watch, professors and the public rate the performance of American democracy, and have since 2017, on a scale from 0, which would signify a complete dictatorship, to 100, a perfect democracy. After President Trump's election in November, scholars gave American democracy a rating of 67. And then, several weeks into Trump's second term, that figure plummeted to 55 from the experts, and the American public was even more pessimistic, rating American democracy in the low 40s. Okay? A decline that was recorded among Republicans, independents, and Democrats. The message from the survey was clear that American democracy is going in the wrong direction. Now, in the time since January, scholars and journalists covering the second Trump administration have increasingly turned to international examples of democratic backsliding to explain the change in government system that they're seeing in the United States. Stories abound. President Trump's threats to withhold federal funds from American universities unless they eliminate diversity programs have been compared to Viktor Orban's playbook in Hungary. President Trump's attack on media companies that offer critical coverage of his administration have been noted to echo Hugo Chavez's assaults on Venezuela's oldest private television station through revoking their license. And political scholars have drawn parallels between President Trump's use of the Justice Department to target political opponents, most recently former FBI Director James Comey, and compared this to Erdogan's prosecution of his political enemies in Turkey. Yet, the conversation we have today on this stage will challenge this impulse to look abroad for examples of democratic backsliding and authoritarianism, and instead turn to our own history books and look back. Throughout American history, some of our most storied presidents have been accused of acting like autocrats. Lincoln, who I know Jamelle is of interest to you particularly, has been accused of being a dictator. In fact, I found a law review article. The title was Lincoln the Dictator. Okay? Lincoln was accused in his time of being the godfather of despotism. Okay? FDR faced criticism for aggressive use of executive power in response to both the Great Depression and World War II. Okay? Moving more towards the modern era, of course, we're well versed in the presidency of Richard Nixon and the abuses of the FBI and the CIA to sabotage his political opponents. Okay? And even beyond the federal level, the story continues at the state level. Rob Mickey, who shares our stage here, wrote a book, a great book, award-winning book, Paths Out of Dixie, about authoritarian state governments that enforced Jim Crow in the South, with many Americans having lived under one-party state rule for decades, if not their whole lives. Those folks experiencing democracy more in name than in practice. Okay? So our panelists today will help us examine how authoritarian currents have emerged throughout U.S. history, how institutions and movements have responded, and what those lessons mean for our present moment. Let's meet our panelists. First, to my right, we have Jamelle Bouie, who brings a distinctive historical lens to understanding contemporary American democracy. A New York Times columnist and 2021 Hillman Prize recipient, Bouie connects past and present, showing how America's historical struggles with racial exclusion and authoritarianism illuminate today's challenges to democratic norms. Elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2024, he is recognized as one of the nation's leading voices on the intersection of history, race, and democracy. Okay? To his right, we have Robert Mickey. He is an associate professor of political science at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on U.S. politics in comparative and historical perspective. He is interested in the country's belated as well as incomplete democratization by the 1970s, its current democratic backsliding, and the place of racial conflict in each. Mickey is the author of Paths Out of Dixie, The Democratization of Authoritarian Enclaves in America's Deep South, 1944 to 1972, which won the 2016 Greenstone Prize and the 2017 V.O. Key Award for Best Book on Southern Politics. He is now at work on a book-length study of Reconstruction in cross-national perspective and the study of the relationship between America's racial attitudes and their support for democracy. Today's session will be divided into two parts. In the first 50 minutes, I'll moderate a discussion with our panelists, and in the second half, we'll open up to you, the audience, for questions. Let's begin. And as I sit down, please join me in welcoming our panelists. Jamelle and Rob, I want to start from base principles. So, as I alluded to in the opening, the pace at which the Trump administration has moved has caught scholars and journalists a little flat-footed in how to exactly describe the moment. So, Jamelle, one of your recent articles talked about the kind of spectacle of Trump's authoritarianism. Rob, you wrote a book on authoritarianism. I have heard the moment described as an authoritarian turn, as competitive authoritarianism, as kleptocracy, democratic backsliding. So I wonder if you can help situate us by describing how you see this moment and why it's important to get the categorization right.
Well, first, thank you for having us. Thank you for organizing this discussion. You know, to be perfectly honest, I'm not so certain that it's important to get the categorization exactly right. It's obviously interesting to talk about and argue about. Like, just thinking practically, I think thinking practically, it's more important to just like recognize that something bad is happening, whatever you want to call it, right? Like, whatever you want to call it, it's not great, right? If you want to call it authoritarianism, if you want to call it fascism, whatever it is, prefer it not to be happening. So I'm not sure I think that it's super important to get the categorization right. Having said that, I do, like, my own view of what is happening is that it's not quite that we are now an authoritarian state or that we're now existing in some sort of competitive authoritarianism. I would describe it as the president and his allies kind of launching a full spectrum attack on constitutional government, on rule of law in the United States, and trying to unravel that and replace it with some kind of form of personalist governance, right? Governance that revolves entirely around the will of the president, of this leader who is, for all intents and purposes, like an elected dictator. And in furtherance of that, they want to undermine the electoral system. They want to destroy any kind of meaningful checks and balances. You know, they've gotten assistance from a Congress that is sort of voluntarily supine, but one expects that if Democrats win Congress next year, there's going to be like real conflict about congressional power and its ability to rein in the president. And you're seeing this very novel effort to extend presidential power, not just over the entire executive branch or over the entire government, but over the entire society, with the White House making claims like universities have to do X, Y, or Z in accordance with the president's priorities, where in the past we'd be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, you know, the president isn't president of I'm a UVA alum. President isn't president of UVA. He's just relative to UVA. He's just a guy, right? But the view of the White House and of its allies is that the president is almost some kind of like embodiment of the national spirit, and so everything must be aligned with what the president's priorities are. So again, whatever you want to call that, I'm very open to all kinds of arguments about how one should categorize that. But I think that regardless of how you categorize it, I think it should be recognized as in direct conflict with American constitutional principles, with American-style democracy, and that even stipulating the nation's history of illiberalism, stipulating the nation's history with authoritarianism, there are a lot of ways in which it does mark a kind of like rupture with past practice.
Okay. So, Rob, before we get to you, can I just push back a little as far as the Constitution? So, when I am up here and teaching Intro to American Government, we talk about the Constitution originally not having a lot of democratic elements and like those being folded over time. So when you talk about the assault on constitutional government, you're talking about like the evolved Constitution.
No, I mean, right? I'm actually talking I'm talking about both, right?
Okay.
It's both an assault on like democracy as we understand it, which is this evolved constitutional understanding. But I'd say it's an assault on like the very kind of, 1787 Republican self-government conceptions of what the Constitution is, right? The attempt to consolidate autocratic power around the president runs directly counter to I would say the vision embodied in the Constitution. It was, as I'm sure you know, when opponents of ratification said we should not do this, they pointed to exactly this possibility, right? Like this is a thing that might happen. And supporters of ratification argued, don't be silly, it's not going to happen. We've designed something too good for this to happen. So I actually would describe this as not just anti-democratic, but like anti-lowercase r Republican, which to my mind just underscores the radicalism of it. Like this really is an attempt to do regime change.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, I shouldn't say this because academics kind of make their money parsing concepts and arguing with each other about labels, but I actually don't think it matters a lot either. I mean, I guess if pressed, I'd say that we're a democracy undergoing democratic backsliding, which just generally means a decline in the quality of democracy. If that decline is not stopped, then we'd become something like Levitsky and Ziblatt would call competitive authoritarianism, meaning a country that has elections, but boy, the deck is so stacked in favor of the incumbent that they're no longer free and fair. So yeah, Putin has elections, Erdogan has elections, Orban has elections, but no one would call them free or fair, not even them. So yeah, I guess I think as Jamelle does, that it's just more important just for citizens to get a sense of the directionality, that we're going south and that's not good. I think it's also useful, speaking of history, to think about the US as a young democracy in trouble. And I think the reason I think it's correct, one, because we became a democracy in the standard sense of free and fair elections, guaranteed civil rights and civil liberties necessary for those elections to be free and fair, and rule of law. We didn't become a democracy until the Voting Rights Act was on solid ground in the late 60s or something like that. I think it's useful to say that we're a young democracy, both to appreciate that, wow, it's, young democracies have a tougher time, and we've had a pretty good, we didn't always think it was good, but a pretty good half-century run, and now we're in trouble. And we're in trouble, I think, largely for the reasons that we weren't a democracy until then, which has to do with racial conflict, and we can talk more about that later. But I think that thinking about classifying the U.S. as a young democracy helps keep in mind that, boy, these things are tough to build and maintain.
And in comparative studies, do young democracies, are they more susceptible to democratic backsliding and change in regimes?
I think generally so. I don't think there's necessarily a lot of consensus about that. But yeah, if you think about the democracies that were very young and now kind of going south, say in Eastern Europe, Hungary and Poland in particular, the Soviet Union, then Russia had a few years in the 90s when things didn't look completely terrible yet, and now. But yeah, I think that's true of all kinds of regimes, that they're more likely to founder when they're young and they either haven't consolidated their institutions yet, or politicians haven't gotten used to this idea that we can lose this election and it's not going to be catastrophic, so therefore we should pick ourselves up and try to do better next time instead of going to buy guns, right? So this, Adam Pravorsky has this great line, that democracy is a system in which parties lose elections, right? And I think that's one of those things that takes a while to develop.
Can I say, though, that although I do agree with that way of looking at the situation, it also seems to me that you can hold everything the same about the path and development of American democracy from 1965 to 2016, and if the 2016 presidential nominee for the Republicans was Jeb Bush, we wouldn't be here, right? But like if it was Jeb Bush and we all clapped for him and he won the nomination. I'm glad people thought that was funny.
Good memories too, right?
Yeah. Wasn't quite sure about that one. That I do think that so much of this represents like the unique pathologies of Donald Trump. Like Donald Trump's belief that he can't lose has filtered down to the Republican Party in important ways. Like there's always been, I think, among Republicans, a sort of sense that, or institutional Republicans, a kind of frustration with, very liberal voting laws and whatnot. But the kind of outright rejection of electoral defeat, that feels very much like, if not for Donald Trump, not a thing that really would have developed. And I think that as much as I'm inclined towards structural explanations, a large part of me does think that it's simply like the force of Trump's personality. It's like a man on horseback kind of situation. Like the force of Trump's personality does seem to have introduced into what was a kind of mostly consolidated democracy a lot of the backsliding.
So I guess I don't think that there's necessarily a tension there, because you're right, 2016 election was highly contingent. He's about to criminally prosecute the person who gave him the win, Jim Comey, right? What a complicated figure he'll turn out to be. But he didn't come from nowhere. You're right, it's what we're dealing with now is unthinkable in the, if there were a different Republican, most other Republicans. That's certainly true. But two things. One is that there was a quarter century of challenges to democracy beginning around 2000 at the state level, of which he's completely innocent. That's driven by other stuff that we'll have time to talk about. But also and you're right, his pathologies are many. His vengeance tour, all of that is very specific to him. But he's also joining his party's sustained efforts since Nixon, especially since Reagan, to chip away at the administrative state in ways that he's really accelerating, so much so that I totally agree with you. It's not just a damage to the rule of law or the Constitution that we like, which is the post-Reconstruction Constitution, but this is a challenge to 1787 type checks and balances. So I totally agree with you, but a lot of that is, there's a lot of continuity with, especially from W on, a different Bush, from W on in having Republicans so tightly embraced, both in the White House and in the courts, this unitary executive theory, which is their main argument for why presidents should be able to do away with progressive policies and agencies, as Trump said yesterday, Democrat agencies that they don't like.
Yeah. So I want to add something to this conversation. So going back to 2016, there's scholarship, I'm thinking of like Scotchpole and Williamson talking about the Tea Party movement, right, where it wasn't about smaller government, it wasn't about the bailout packages, right, it was about racial attitudes and racism. And if Hillary Clinton wins in an alternative universe in 2016, again, structure versus like the uniqueness of Trump, do you get someone who is like Trump in 2020, right, after 2 terms of the first, black president and then the first woman president, would there have been just a moment where like the backlash was just kind of building up, and in 2016 it manifested in a figure like Trump to Obama, but then you add a Clinton first term onto that and then you get, a similar type figure in 2020.
I don't know. You can imagine.
But like getting at the racial backlash
Right.
general, like versus like playing hypothetical.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that I think you may have gotten something like Trump in that scenario. I mean, it's interesting to think about because, to go back to 2016, to turn the page back then, one of the intra-Republican arguments that was happening was just sort of how does the Republican Party respond to this electorate? The path that I think people thought it was on at the beginning of that year was that the Republican Party has to at least be responsive to the kinds of diversifying changes that are happening in the electorate. And so this was kind of the Marco Rubio pitch or the Jeb Bush pitch, that we can kind of reconstruct the George W. Bush style coalition of trying to win over more conservative African Americans, win over more conservative leaning Hispanic voters, and create something like a multiracial conservative coalition. And Trump in 2016 demonstrated that there's a large chunk of the electorate are whites without college degrees. A significant chunk of the electorate, if you make it salient, we'll see, the racial attitudes is like the thing they want to vote on, and you can win an election, barely, but you can win an election having cobbled together this kind of coalition that kind of ignores the received wisdom about what Republicans had to do. And so what's interesting about our 2020 is that Trump, and for our 2024, Trump improved his performance with Black and Hispanic voters. Specifically Black and Hispanic men. And I guess you can't imagine a situation where it's Clinton that wins and Republicans are still having this intra-party debate, but Clinton's, in the same way that Obama's presence makes race incredibly salient, just him existing, Clinton being president would have made gender, I think, very salient, even more so in American politics. And I think you can imagine a Trump-like figure happening, but it would be more explicitly around gender. And it would look more like, I think, Trump of 2024, which was, I think, heavily centered on a backlash to perceptions and changes in gender norms than race. Like, to a certain extent, I mean, this sounds sort of insane when you think about it, but to a certain extent, like last year saw a decline in racial polarization in American politics. It's just like a bunch of men across the racial lines were like really mad about women, and so they voted for Trump. And inflation. Yeah, ladies and eggs, but not ladies' eggs.
Yeah, there you go, yeah.
Although that's not true either.
Well, actually, that's part of it, yeah. Yeah, great, okay, thanks.
So I was also thinking about 2016, but also 2012. So I guess it would depend on how the Clinton administration went, whether she won a second term or something. But in the interest of structural arguments, you know, there's this very pivotal early 2013 autopsy that the Republican National Committee is doing, right, where they're deciding, as you said, you know, this isn't working. We need to, after Obama's re-election, we need to pivot. We need to embrace bipartisan immigration reform, et cetera, et cetera. And they chose not to do that well before Trump had arrived, right? The party, for a bunch of reasons, couldn't get there, right? And even Rubio and Cruz and all of these people say, you know, they consider that. Lindsey Graham famously said, we're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for much longer. They're freaked out about demographic change. They think they need to pivot in a bipartisan way on that, and they just don't. And that was before Trump.
I want to turn now to thinking about how the two of you are trying to understand this moment historically. So again, this administration has launched 1,000 think pieces. I've heard talk about potential American Civil War, people talking about, you know, a new McCarthyism, talk about a rising like Jim Crow 2. You know, people have brought up the Nixon administration. When you two, who are steeped in history, are looking backward, like what is a moment in American history that you think helps you personally understand what's going on and why?
You go first. Please.
Okay. A moment in American history, because that was my
or a period, or
no. Yeah. Well, my inclination, just for answering the question, is just to think that the things that people have said, right, like referencing McCarthyism, referencing Jim Crow, saying we're going to be facing a Jim Crow 2, Crow harder or something. That thank you. That to me, that's reflective of the fact that the United States does have this tradition of illiberalism and illiberal government, right? That does extend to the beginning of our history and continues on. And so there's a lot about Trump that in this second administration for which you can find very relevant and almost like direct antecedents. So the recent attack on free speech, you know, people weren't treating Charlie Kirk like a martyr, so the government's like, we're gonna go after you. Very Red Scare, very McCarthyism. It's very reminiscent of that. I would describe the transformation of ICE into this almost secret police as having a lot of continuities with the Wilson era use of government to like punish dissent, to expel immigrants, right? Like there are a lot of similarities and continuities there. The Palmer raids. So I'm not sure that there's a single moment as much as it is, this to me serves as a reminder that there's so much in our history that you can find that informs this period, not as like one-to-one examples or one-to-one analogies, but as similar kind of tendencies that have existed and that are coming to the fore again today. I'll say though that the thing that I do regularly return to, just because it's a period of interest for me, is Reconstruction. And I do think that Reconstruction may be especially relevant given the administration's arguments and claims just about who is to be included in like American democracy, who's to be included in the nation. And the administration's vision of a very narrow and like very racialized national community speaks directly to the kinds of questions that Reconstruction was trying to settle. I've written about Dred Scott like a couple times in the last few months, and written about that ruling in detail. And that ruling is, as in Taney's opinion at the very least, is like fundamentally about this question of like, who belongs, like who counts. And the 14th Amendment, its first words are a repudiation of the Taney view or the Stephen A. Douglas view, or just sort of this antebellum exclusionary view of who belongs. And the fact that the administration is, for all intents and purposes, like resurrecting the Taney view of who belongs and trying to impose that upon the 14th Amendment, to my mind, makes Reconstruction, makes that amendment in all the circumstances and debates around that amendment and the politics of citizenship in the 1850s and 1860s, like very, very relevant to us today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I agree that Reconstruction was the first time that we attempted to build multiracial democracy, and it was defeated. And then we built it kind of, sort of okay in the 50s and 60s, and now some of the legacies unleashed by that kind of belated democratization are we're dealing with now, exactly as he's saying. I guess I'd say, though, that I don't think that there's a historical parallel in that sense. Like, I don't think we were a democracy before the 60s. Yes, you can think about moments when rule of law was especially challenged, or free and fair elections were especially challenged, or civil rights and civil liberties weren't guaranteed. But we were never full democracy dealing with backsliding before. That's why, I guess maybe paradoxically, as an American history person, I'm turning more to comparative cases. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to pull on something that I think maybe connects these two answers. So when we talk about the illiberal history and America being a young democracy, not really until the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act of the 60s, when you think about democracy, there's the institutions, there's the norms, and then there's the practices, right? And I've heard some optimistic pundits say that the American people have a norm of democracy, and that this adherence to the norm of democracy from regular people at some point will present a wall or a barrier to some of this backsliding. So I'm wondering how the two of you think about democracy in those three categories of institutions versus norms versus procedures.
I think that's a useful set of divisions to make. And like Rob, I wouldn't describe the United States prior to the 1960s as like a democracy in the sense that we would recognize it. But I would say that the United States, even in times of, broad exclusion of large numbers of people, still had a kind of democratic culture and a democratic self-conception, in that those things, they matter and they're quite powerful, and they've been leveraged by various reformers throughout the country's history to try to expand out the institutions themselves, try to make clear, this is just an abstract description of the civil rights movement, right? Like making abundantly clear the distance between the democratic self-conception of the people and the actual institutions of the country. I would say that in this moment, I think we do have, so I think it's true that in this moment, Americans still do conceive of themselves as a democratic people. I think it's always important to note that this means different things to different groups, and for some people, a society where categories of people are subjugated on a racial basis may still be democratic in their eyes. But sort of setting that aside, I do think it's true, and I think it's been demonstrated quite recently, that this democratic self-conception can pose an obstacle to the kind of rapid authoritarian consolidation I think the administration wants to achieve. So the whole Jimmy Kimmel affair, right? The Jimmy Kimmel being pretty explicitly pressured off the air by the head of the FEC, Brendan Carr, and then the public at large just getting really angry about it and engaging in kind of informal boycotts and vocal condemnation and enough sustained pressure to cause ABC to reverse its decision, to cause the distributors like Sinclair to reverse their decision, and to prompt the administration to say, "Oh, we really didn't mean it. We really weren't trying to, pressure Kimmel off of air. We're just little guys. We weren't trying to do anything." So I don't think the administration anticipated that, and I do think that, especially when the White House, when the president takes these moves that aren't just authoritarian, but authoritarian in ways that are culturally legible, right? Like I think Americans, because of our cultural content, the movies we watch, the books we read, when you show the government forcing a comedian off the air, that's like legible to people in a really key way. If I live in Virginia, if I were driving to visit my parents in South Carolina and crossing the North Carolina border, I had to show my papers, right? Someone's like, "Papers, please." I think most Americans would be like, "Okay, wait a sec, that's not okay," because it triggers something culturally legible to them. And I do think that to the extent that the administration's moves towards a more authoritarian type government are explicit in ways that just raise people's hackles because they recognize them from TV, even from movies, I think that's going to pose an obstacle. The flip side of that, though, is that it's not hard to imagine, maybe a smarter group of people in the White House trying to do this thing, where instead of from the gate, they're trying to pressure everyone into submission. It's a few months of, we're going to send out checks to everyone. We're going to focus entirely on economic management. We're going to make sure you feel like, Trump is back in office and making you rich. And then after 6 or 7 months of that, then we're going to start doing the consolidation stuff. And I think that would have been vastly more successful than what they're trying now. So I wouldn't put all my marbles in the Americans imagine themselves as democratic people jar. But I think that given how things have unfolded, it's a real thing and it's a meaningful obstacle.
Are you interviewing for a job as a strategist for the White House or something?
I mean, the funny thing about it, right, is that it kind of was. I mean, it was pretty easy. You didn't have to be a genius to think of a better way to do authoritarianism.
You're frustrated with their not being smart enough.
I'm glad they aren't, but there is something funny about the extent to which I think we like to imagine an authoritarian as someone scheming and cunning, but very often that's not the case, right? Very often, history is often made by morons, right? That this is just true, but they're persistent, right? They're persistent, they're stubborn, and persistence and stubbornness can get you a long way. And so in this case, I don't necessarily think that Stephen Miller is a genius. It's just that Stephen Miller is very persistent and very stubborn and a true believer. I think that the White House
doing a lot of planning over the prior 4 years.
Right. There's a lot of true believers, a lot of people who really want this. But the flip side of that, the flip side of them being true believers, is that I think they also may have, gotten a little high on their own supply here, and so they don't necessarily conceptualize either their opponent or the public at large as having any kind of agency. And so I'd say that if you were to observe the past 7 or 8 months, they're consistently taken aback when there is meaningful pushback. They just don't imagine it happening.
A good example of that, as you said, is Brendan Carr's statement that, hey, on a podcast to ABC, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And Ted Cruz rightly said, why is the head of the SEC sounding like a mafia boss, right? Mm-hmm. There is that. They are surprised. And on this issue of the citizens' democratic self-conception, or their view of their country as a democracy, I agree it's a problem, but it's mainly still a resource. It's a problem because, and this is true around the world, when democracies backslide, most backsliding is comprised of kind of a death of 1,000 cuts, usually completely legal actions. Trump administration is reckless and illegal, maybe not in ways the Supreme Court will rightly acknowledge, but certainly doing a lot of illegal and unconstitutional things. But usually backsliders take a lot of very gradual legal steps, and it's kind of like the frog that doesn't realize it's being boiled, right? So for a country where there's a lot of faith, that I want to come back to that 40% thing you mentioned, but where there's a lot of faith or understanding that to be an American is to, whatever I think of politics, is to live in a democracy, that can be a problem because you're caught unaware. The thing that's made me most optimistic, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I was pleasantly surprised by the statement by Sinclair, which is this network, this set of very, very conservative local TV affiliates, right? And their statement after a week of saying, well, we're still not going to show Kimmel, damn it, and then a few days later they said, well, sure we are. It was so meek, and it speaks to that issue of their surprise, right? And that's not a meek organization, right? I think that people, I think Americans, at some point, they need these focusing events like Kimmel or something that hits them in their real life, not talking about rule of law, right? In a way that can motivate them. You know, I think there's a sense that there's less protest going on, but there's much more protest now to date, January till today, than there was in 2017. Yeah. It's not being covered, but there's a lot more. So Erica Chenoweth at the Kennedy School has great stuff on this. I guess I'd say I agree that Americans support democracy. I think that the Americans who are least supportive of it are those who are, we have a lot of good evidence that shows, are those for whom their white identity is very important to them. They're more interested in a strongman leader who secures results no matter what. I think, so Americans are generally pro-democracy. It's just that the evidence in 2024 was that not many of them were going to lift a finger to defend it, right? Because talk about a focusing event, there was not things, few things clearer than January 6th, right? And it wasn't that long before, it was 3 years before. And if that wasn't enough to make them think, yeah, inflation sucks, but still, for democracy's sake, I'm going to do something else.
I don't know if I put the entire blame on the public there, though, because I do think that, to an extent, the public was responding to the behavior of political elites, sure. Right? That if President Biden, right, is not going to treat Jan 6 as an event requiring the immediate attention of the U.S. government when they're actually in power, if no one's going to behave as if there's a fire there, then I think the public actually quite reasonably goes, well, there must not be much of a fire there, right? Like, I think the public's response is very often shaped by how political elites behave, and whether political elites behave if even there's smoke in the horizon, and then the public's like, okay, maybe there's something I should care about. But I do think that the response of the Biden administration, the desire to move forward and not look back in those first months of the Biden administration and kind of let Trump do his own thing, I think it persuaded a lot of people that maybe this wasn't that big of a deal. And when it came to 2024, and Democrats trying to make this argument that, like, January 6th, the president is this threat, or the former president is this threat to democracy. If you were a skeptical voter, you could rightfully say, then why isn't he in jail, right? Like, if he's so dangerous, then why is he running for president? And I don't think Democrats had a single good answer for that. And when you're asking, I think, voters to weigh kind of an abstraction at that point against food's more expensive is always going to win out. I'll say, though, the other side of this is that Trump didn't really run on, I'm going to end American democracy. Like, he did run primarily on, I'm going to lower prices. And I do think that some of the political vulnerability that we've seen is just a result of this. That, like, this was a narrow election. The decisive voters weren't like handing Trump an enabling act. And a lot of them, it turns out, they're like, oh, look, he's doing stuff that we didn't anticipate or we didn't believe him.
I totally agree they weren't voting for backsliding. But I do think, there are lots of abstractions, and how hard is Merrick Garland working on the prosecution, blah, blah, blah. First of all, they're not following news that closely.
Right.
But boy, January 6th, there's a lot of video, and there's, like, if you wanted, like, you're into movies, and if you want moving images that show an attack on democracy on certification of election day, you can't get much better. I agree that maybe President Newsom would run roughshod over the Department of Justice and interfere in ways that we would really find completely inappropriate given the independence of the DOJ. But Biden was old school and wasn't going to do it.
No.
I still have a couple more questions before we turn it over to the audience. I want to bring us into the White House. So if they would watch this video, they might laugh, right, and say, listen, we're just moving aggressively. We're not doing anything that past presidents haven't done, right? We're trying to be a reconstructive president, right, and make a lasting legacy, and that's what this looks like. And there's arguments about the unitary executive theory that are out there. What I want you to do is think of, like, what is the strongest argument that you have heard about what the Trump administration that is doing, and take that at its face, and how would you respond?
I mean, I think you kind of just made it, that they're acting in accordance with the will of the people, or something like that. I mean, my response to that, part of it is to point out the narrowness of the election result, which I do think is not appreciated enough in sort of public conversation about the 2024 election. I think that a lot of commentators and observers, they are stuck on the evening of election night when it looked like a real, just decisive victory for Trump, and have not done enough to pay attention to the final results, which show a very, very narrow result for Trump. That could have gone the other way if conditions were just a little bit better for Harris. But beyond that, I'd say, listen, we do know what it looks like when presidents try to implement an expansive and sweeping agenda. In 1933, Roosevelt introduced reams of legislation. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson introduced reams of legislation. In 1981, Ronald Reagan introduced reams of legislation. Like, what it looks like when a president seeks to transform American government is they pass laws. And this president has basically abdicated any attempt to try to pass laws, and instead is trying to do things autocratically. And that, to me, is the most meaningful and important difference, that in your refusal to even engage with the legislature and with the constitutional system that it represents, you are showing that this isn't really about just trying to set a new direction for the country. This is trying to change the nature of the regime. I've said this before in other forums. if, I don't like this administration, but if President Trump and Speaker Johnson and Majority Leader Thune got together and passed a bunch of laws implementing the president's agenda, I would be very angry about it, but I'd be like, hey, them's the breaks, They have the majorities. The fact that this isn't even on the horizon for any of these people, to my mind, is actually the main sign that this is something different, right? Like this isn't about ambition to set a new path, because as we all know, the thing about passing laws is it's hard to unpass laws, right? Like it's basically permanent. We still live in a lot of ways in the tax regime created by Reagan. It's just like they passed a law in 1981, 1986, and here we are. The administration is doing everything through executive fiat and is behaving as if this cannot be reversed. So either they really are deep in the sauce, or their intentions are very different than a typical presidential administration.
I don't think it's fair that he gets to answer first. I've changed my mind. Because I always say, like, yeah, I agree.
Ron, I promise to pitch you the last question.
Thank you. So I would say to the administration, why so unpopular? They would counter and say, oh, those are Democrat polls, but that's not true. But yeah, it's wild to think that they have a trifecta. They control both chambers. Both chambers are staffed with Republicans who are very happy to do the president's bidding and never do any oversight, right? So they're abdicating their institutional responsibility. But Jamelle, as usual, is exactly right. They're governing as if Democrats control both chambers, so they're forced to do all these executive orders. Like the DOGE stuff, like, why not just pass an insane budget? And maybe now they're finally going to do that. But it's just extraordinary, the reliance on unilateral action. It's not extraordinary in comparative perspective because populist leaders get so frustrated with any kind of veto points, any institutions that mediate their ability to change policy. And Trump, I think, is extra impatient given that, he couldn't even get a wall built. He couldn't do a lot of things with 2 years. He couldn't get rid of ACA with 2 years of Republican dominance in Congress. So, this second time, the second tour is a lot different and a lot worse for us.
Okay. So this will be my last question before I turn it over to the audience. And the way this will work is that we have a couple people with microphones. If you have a question, please raise your hand and they'll come and see you. So being Midwestern, I want to try to end on a positive note. Your book was about democratization, right? The paths out of Dixie, out of authoritarianism, white supremacy to a more multiracial democracy. You wrote an op-ed about the decline of the Fourth Republic, but we had a Fourth Republic in America that was a more pluralist, multiracial democracy. What lessons from our past about democratization can we take now? Like what could you, if a student comes to you in the reception and says, like, what can I do as an individual or within an organization to try to re-democratize the United States, what would you tell them?
I think Jamelle's going to take the first one. So I guess I'd say the main lesson would be from, say, the 30s to the 60s when the parties got along incredibly well in Congress. There's very little polarization. They drink with each other all the time. Everything's great because that was built on an agreement not to deal with race, right? And individual Americans, not as individuals, but working in groups, which is the absolute key thing I would say to students, they forced that onto their agenda, right? They forced that to happen. So I think that there are a lot of reasons. The Republican Party has a lot of problems. The Democratic Party has even more. They're just different ones. So I'd say popular mobilization is the one thing that I would flag from our recent past.
And I would say just in terms of making demands on, say, the Democratic Party, I think there's going to be, depending on how next year goes and what 2028 looks like, I think there's going to be a real inclination to do another look forward, let's not look back. A combination of look forward, but also let's see how much we can restore the status quo ante. And I'd say that if there's any silver lining to this administration's destruction of so much of the administrative state, the federal bureaucracy, maybe it's a clean slate, right? Maybe this is an opportunity to think a little bigger and broader and more ambitiously about the kind of government we want and the kind of democracy we want. And we can say, as much as I admire the New Deal era, it's gone now. It's gone. The Great Society is being torn up, so we have to have something new. And I would say that a lesson we can take from the past is that Americans have engaged in this kind of big picture, ambitious thinking about the kind of society they want to live in, and now is the time to engage in that again.
Okay, great. Thank you both. Now we'll turn it over to you. Please let us know what your questions are. And also, if you could please introduce yourself as well.
You want me to go first? Okay. Hi, Emily Thorson. I'm in the political science department. So one of the most disappointing parts of the last few years for me has been just the total capitulation of Republican elites to all of Trump's efforts. I sort of held out hope there would be some kind of resistance. Clearly there hasn't been. I'm curious whether you all think that this is a coordination problem or whether half of our elected officials actually just don't care if democracy goes away.
I think that in 2016, it was 100% a coordination problem, right? That it was very clear that Republican elites did not want Donald Trump. They didn't want him because they thought he was going to lose horribly, but they couldn't figure out how to coordinate their opposition, right? Everyone wanted to be the last person standing. No one was willing to just, sit down and let Jeb have it.
You really love Jeb Bush.
I just think exclamation point.
Yeah, I just think it's funny that sort of like, I don't know, we don't often have big nerds run for president, and so to have this like nerdlinger run for president is really funny to me. Anyway, 2016 a coordination problem. 2020 just sort of, he's a president, buy-in, that's where we are. I think today, in the present, it's not so much a coordination problem. I think a lot of the Republican elites who are opposed to an authoritarian turn have just been purged from the party. And they've been replaced by people who are enthusiastically pro-Trump. I think those that still have misgivings and are still there, they are afraid of being purged from the party. I think there's real fear of physical violence from the president's most diehard supporters. And I think that they're essentially convinced that they can't win without Trump's force of personality. And so there's just no incentive for them to act differently. It was interesting, back in after the 2022 midterms, when Democrats won, I think did surprisingly well, you began to see inklings of maybe a bit of a rebellion. Like Ron DeSantis was there. It was like, oh, we can have a guy with similar politics, but not Trump, who's dragging us down. But then Ron DeSantis crashed and burned, and everyone got back behind Trump. The last thing I'll say is that what I find super interesting, and it's something I don't have an answer for, is just the kind of lack of big picture ambition amongst the oldest generation of Republican leaders. So think back to January 7th, when the smoke had just basically cleared, and Republicans in Congress were genuinely freaked out by what happened and were genuinely afraid. And you could tell in just like their faces and their voices that like a Mitch McConnell and all those guys were like, this has gotten completely out of control. And one would think that someone like McConnell, at the end of his career, nothing to lose, will go back home to Kentucky and will, be a god to half the people there. One would think that a Mitch McConnell could have said right then and there, we're going to impeach and remove this guy. And if that had happened, if Mitch McConnell had done that, then 100 years from now, Mitch McConnell's name would be like a chapter in history books, right? Like Mitch McConnell would be a hero of American democracy. But that kind of ambition he didn't seem to have, to be like a person for the ages. In the absence of that, I find baffling, right? Like the same way I find it weird that our billionaires today don't build like big like hubristic buildings to their own egos. Like, why don't you do that? That's like a normal thing for a crazy rich person to do.
We've got a Carnegie Library, right?
Yeah. It's this lack of big picture ambition that I find really weird and strange.
I think there's a little bit of a coordination problem. The issue of personal fear about what could happen to their fear of their own voters hurting them and their family is wild, but shouldn't be underestimated. Tom Tillis said some of his votes on nomination votes were made with an eye to personal safety. Not everybody, like Romney, can afford 24/7 security for their family. On the other hand, a lot of election deniers are now members of the House and soon will be, or already are, members of the Senate. I will say, again, in the interests of structural explanation, on January 6th, while the smoke was still there, 2/3 of Republicans in the House voted not to certify the election. 2/3, which is pretty wild. So yeah, I guess the one way, or when I expect to see Republicans, office holders exhibit a little bit more independence will be in January 27, when Trump is kind of officially a lame duck president, and they're going to be less concerned about what his Truth Social and Twitter game can do to their careers in the party. I mean, they'll still be worried. There might be another voice. There will be other populist voices, but Trump's is louder and more effective, so, yeah.
We'll hear from this side.
Hi, Eric Vandervoort. Thanks so much for talking. I had one sort of comment and then question, academic. And I would say, citing on Professor Chenoweth's work on crowds and protest, it's hard to say that it's not covered because the very product that she's producing is the product of coverage. So every data point that's in there is a report about protest. So the coverage is diffuse and is widespread. And I think what she's doing is bringing clarity to that and things. But it's actually really hard to make the claim that it's not being covered because the data set is generated from media coverage and reliable reports. But I want to ask more generally a question about sort of, and I like the characterization of America as a young democracy, but it sort of is in tension with we are a young democracy, but an old republic with deep democratic traditions and, I would say, yearnings. And that's kind of the secondary point that I want to ask you to talk to, because I came in today hoping we would hear, like, what's the path out of this Dixie? Or to avoid this Dixie, because that's kind of what we're looking at. But there is a strong, there has been and continues to be this strong and sustained social movement activity and resistance activity to the administration, which I think feeds on that deep dissatisfaction with democratic backsliding that we're seeing from a lot of American people. So I want to hear a little more from you all, aside from the Jimmy Kimmel stuff and all that. But we've really seen, for example, I mean, I'll end here, but like with the creation of the resistance of 2016, that shit came to life this year already. It took a couple months for that, but that protest activity is building off of social movement work that had happened from 2016 to 2024. So this is another democratic tradition. We could go into King and Smith and the kind of egalitarian and racist order and all that stuff, but there is a competing impulse in American politics that has to catch up for sure, but it's trying to. So I'd like to hear, I guess, what's the path to avoid this Dixie, something, I don't know what the pithy way to talk about it is, but I'd like to hear both of you talk more about, like, we don't have to be optimists, but we can be realistic about the opportunities that we have. We have the moment now to not go down this path. We have that chance. So talk more about that, please.
Sure. I think at this stage, part of the role of this social mobilization is to stiffen the spines of civil society, right? To go back to something I said a little earlier, I very strongly believe that the initial impression that Trump had won a decisive victory basically broke the brains of like America's elites. They're just sort of like, it's a vibe shift. We're MAGA America now. We just got to get with the program. And I think the past 8 months have been a slow process of various cohorts of elites figuring out that that's not true, right? That actually about half the country didn't vote for any of this, and they can still act, they still have agency, they still have money to spend, like all these other things. I think that the role of protest movements, of social movements in this moment is just to continue to remind those elites of the fact that a large part of the society does not want any of this, to stiffen their spines, especially if they're elected officials, to stiffen their spines if there are people in my business, right? People who are engaged in public discussion who might still be under the impression that they are operating in a society that is entirely pro-Trump, which is simply not the case. Reminding the political press that that Trump is not actually some tribune of the people, but like a politician and a very unpopular one at that. Doing as much as is possible to just shape the idea space of elites who then, when pressured, right, say no instead of sure. And just the simple act of saying no to the administration, I think we've seen, kind of renders it adrift. Doesn't really know. It is hoping on this sense of we are a locomotive and there's nothing you can do to stop us. And as soon, I'm not even going to try to continue that analogy or that metaphor, but as soon as anyone puts pressure on them, they don't know what to do. They have to find some other maneuver to make. And so for me, that's like right now, that's the thing that can happen. I think looking ahead to next year, looking ahead to continuing developments on the ground would say, the behavior of ICE and Homeland Security. One other thing movements can do, this mobilization can do, is to create as much friction for that part of the administration's efforts, which are much more successful just because the administration has much more authority to act unilaterally. Right now in DC, there's basically just constant jury nullification, and that's the right thing, right? Like, if a friend of mine wrote this recently, and I would suggest the same thing. If you are on a jury related to any kind of charges with ICE or with CBP, just jury nullification. Just do not play games. Do not play the game that they're playing. That kind of thing, which will also begin to influence how elites respond to this, is important to do as well. But like every signal you can send that there is like grassroots and real resistance to authoritarian consolidation, I think it's going to be very valuable. Just because, again, I think a lot of people with power basically got entirely persuaded of some false ideas about the nature of that election.
So I'll be real quick to let other people ask questions. But I would say that an important audience, probably the most important audience of popular mobilization and resistance or no Kings marches or whatever is happening tomorrow. I think there's a no Kings thing tomorrow. Oh, sorry. Okay, jeez. I'm busy. Is actually its fellow citizens and seeing that my spine could be stiffened too, elites as well. But at some point and very quickly, that popular mobilization needs to be linked to winning elections, right? There's a great disdain. Most of these people are on the further left for the Democratic Party, which is understandable, but the fact that a lot of the foot soldiers for popular movements are young people is kind of running into the fact that young people are registering to vote for the first time, but not choosing a party. right? So they're de-aligning, and that's fine, and again, it's totally understandable. But if people want to arrest the Democratic backsliding, winning a chamber in next year is hugely important. So to have the No King stuff divorced from building a way to win elections is a problem. So I think they should be trying to take over what are really and often called hollow local party organizations. Even if they're pro-democracy conservatives, well, they can take over some local Republican organizations too. So I just want to see them make that link to the elections.
Thank you for your discussion. I'm not an academic, so I just ask a question. What is your opinion about John Roberts and the Supreme Court as a moderating influence over the balance of this term?
I was trying not to laugh, and you go ahead.
How about you take the question first?
Okay. So I think the most optimistic thing to say would be that there's still time for the Supreme Court to be a moderating force. The fact that federal courts keep striking down actions by the administration, and then the Supreme Court uses the shadow docket to say, well, we're not going to rule on the merits for a while, but that federal judge that injunction was too broad, and we're going to strike that down, so do what you want for the time being, Trump administration. You know, I think the behavior of the federal courts of appeals has been impressive. A lot of Republican appointed judges are doing these injunctions, but at some point they're going to have to rule on the merits, and it seems like they're about to rule on the merits in ways that are exactly consistent with the unitary executive theory in terms of allowing Trump to clear out federal agencies of staff he doesn't like, except for the Fed, because they read in the Wall Street Journal that would be bad. Yeah, there's still time to be a moderating force, but I'm getting increasingly worried that that's not going to happen.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, here,
So you were talking about winning seats for Democrats in key areas, and I know your colleague Ezra Klein just recently said that like the solution is pro-life Democrats in House GOP seats, but I want to know both of your opinions on like how you see the Democratic Party moving forward from this, and like if there is something that they need to learn from, like you were talking about how prices were what seems to have gotten Trump a lot of the swing from people, and if that's an economic change that you see, or if it's still more of this like we just need seats in the House of like Democrats, it doesn't matter who, just as long as they're along the party line. So what do you, both of you, what do you see as that change?
Yeah. So I do think that, you know, one upshot of thinking of last year's election as not some decisive decision in favor of MAGA, but sort of a very narrow thing about inflation, and then the president just like has not dealt with that whatsoever, is that it means that the public is still gettable, right? That you can still contest the public, you can still utilize that to make inroads using, you know, very straightforward kind of economic pitches. This is what Mamdani basically did in New York to win back some Trump voting New Yorkers, basically to say, listen, cost of living is still an issue, and the president hasn't done anything about it. I want to do something about it. I'll say, though, that I think that, you know, is this being recorded? That
Now you ask?
just a conversation among friends.
I got to be careful how I talk about my colleagues. I think that my colleagues' view that this is, in the view of, I think, of many influential commentators, that the Democratic Party's problems, because I do think they do need to win elections. Like that's just that's just the case, right? Winning elections is the currency of power in this country, and you can have all the nice views you want, and if you don't win elections, it doesn't really matter. So I think winning elections is key, but where I dispute some of my colleagues, and I think a very influential view, is that I don't think this is simply a game of tweaking messaging, of saying, oh, well, I'm pro-life, or, oh, I don't want, trans women to play in sports, and so therefore this is gonna win me the trust I need to win in red areas. I think that the Democratic Party's trust deficit in these areas has a lot to do with just like the nationalization of politics. And so part of the challenge here is gonna be making politics more local, focusing more on the particular district and particular state. But I also think there's a structural issue here with just the American political parties, that they're entirely disconnected from any meaningful popular base, from any meaningful connections to communities. Like put it this way, what does it mean to be a Democrat? It doesn't mean anything, it's just like a consumer label. And I think that part of the path back for Democrats is gonna have to be rethinking what it is that they are as a political party. It is simply a consumer identity for choosing like which flavor of ambitious psychopath you want in office? Or is it something more associational that stands for a set of well-defined principles that you want to advance however you can advance them? And if that's the case, then that also provides a model for thinking about how to win over maybe skeptical people, that you're not trying to appeal to their prejudices, and you're not trying to, do messaging tweaks, that you're saying, these are our principles, and if you share those principles, I would like your vote. I will do things according to the principles that I have, and I will explain them to you as best as I can. And we don't have to agree on everything. We can actually disagree on critical issues of culture. We can do that. But if we agree on these higher ideals of principle, then that's something we can use to work together on. And that kind of way of thinking about politics, that kind of way of thinking about political appeals, is not really in currency with the Democratic Party, but I think has much more potential to build something durable that won't just collapse after an election cycle. So that's where I stand on these things. Like I'm just very skeptical of, if we do this message that we're 10% better in a focus group, then we'll win 50 more votes. Like, I don't think that's gonna work. I think you really do have to rethink what it is we're actually doing here as a political party. What is a political party to begin with?
I like that.
Hi, my name is Allison Harding. I'm a Maxwell alum and a recently fired USAider. So this is personal for me. But I wanted to ask a question about technology as related to the overall theme we're hearing about why now? Why is this happening so quickly and so dramatically now when we've seen this kind of pattern of authoritarian behavior previously in American history? And I'm thinking a lot about the programs we did. I was overseas with USAID in Bosnia, where we supported journalists and civil society. And in recent years, a lot of that support was actually about security and digital security, because they were increasingly under attack, whether by governments or other forces that were unhappy with what they were doing. And also looking at when we went through the dismantling of USAID, we were told very clearly to be careful what we said. We were told, even if you logged into your work phone on your home Wi-Fi, they can actually use that to monitor your personal devices. And whether or not they were doing that, it was very chilling in what we felt comfortable saying and doing, and the level of complicity that they found when they were dismantling the agency. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on generally, what role is technology playing in this accelerated decline in democracy when we're seeing the president posting AI deepfakes very quickly and easily? Everyone's questioning what's true and what's not, and we're also, activists are increasingly at risk of surveillance because it's so easy to do now. So are we in a place where there's anything that can be done to stop those forces? Are our laws up to date with where the technology is that makes it so easy for a government to really carry through with these authoritarian actions? And again, getting back to what can we do about it? How can we make sure that we're responding appropriately in this world where it's so easy to do?
It's a journalism.
It's a journalism question. I do think technology plays like a huge role in what's happening with sort of democratic backsliding, democratic decline. I think it plays a really interesting role in this administration, and the two are connected, which is that part of the political pitch Trump made last year to, let's say, like young men was based in part on an image of reality that's been cultivated by the kind of information sources that they're taking in, right? Sort of, you're listening to, the extended Joe Rogan universe. You're listening to all kinds of right-wing and reactionary content, fitness influencers who are on that level, and they are creating through language this world in which, if you're a young man, you're under assault by a society that is trying to feminize you and blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. Now, that society doesn't exist, right? That's not a thing that's happening in the real world. But this like sphere of content creates like this like hyper reality that for the person inside of it is real. It's real. It's reality. And then the message of the Trump campaign was to directly appeal to that. Like we're appealing to this reality that's been created kind of for you, and there's a synergy between there. In the same way, so what's one of the things interesting to me about the Trump administration thus far is that for every like legitimate, real, authoritarian thing that is happening, and I'm thinking here again of like ICE and the raids, and that's like very concrete and very material, there is this, like the best way I can describe it is like a real life AI slop, right? That like the creation of images that are meant to create the impression of a fully consolidated authoritarian regime where one does not actually exist. So Tuesday's display in Quantico, where you had Pete Hegseth doing his Tom Cruise and Magnolia monologue.
Good 90s movie reference.
Yeah.
Very on brand.
Monologue in front of the big American flag. And if you watch the thing, you were like, this is kind of weird and embarrassing. But the point of the thing is to create the images, to sort of like create this impression, right? That like the military is behind Trump and Hegseth. When the National Guard first got to DC, I was leaving Union Station where they were allowed to be posted up, and I saw a bunch of soldiers kind of standing around, and then I saw like a guy who clearly was like worked for them or worked for whomever, worked for the administration, like taking B-roll, right, to obviously be used in ads or something, all to create this image, all to create this sense of reality that isn't really the case, but they hope to sort of shape people's expectations, make the authoritarian term a fait accompli, because look at all the images, look at all the pictures. How one deals with that, I got no idea, right? Like I have no sense of how one responds to that, especially when the president's allies are just, as we speak, consolidated control over media, traditional and new. So I'm not sure what the response to that is. Part of me thinks that maybe it's just going to be reality imposing itself, as it always does, right? Like if a year of economic mismanagement plunges us into a recession, there's no level of AI slop that's going to convince someone that they can't afford the things they used to be able to afford. I think the question then is, how do people understand the changes in their fortunes politically? It's not an automatic thing. And so if there is nothing being done to give people a language and a way of understanding the things happening to them, in a way that attributes responsibility to the president and his allies, then all of the misfortune in the world isn't really going to change, I think, how people behave politically. And that, again, comes back to what do you do about the media environment. And I I have no idea. I have no clue.
My students know politics from TikTok often, and so I talk about the thing that happened last night, or the 12 things that happened last night, and with screenshots from the Wall Street Journal or Jamelle's paper or wherever, but papers, they kind of nod and say, yeah, okay, whatever. When I put up the quote that Trump said, I want to make US TikTok MAGA, they freaked out, right? So I think that, the trick is to develop more skepticism especially among young people, about what's in their algorithm, what's in what they're reading, without them going so far as to say, who can tell truth and falsity are no longer useful concepts, everything is just blah, 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 right? But they're worried about that, so it'd be nice if they respond by, if TikTok changes in a way that they don't like, that they say, forget this. I was heartened by a friend of mine who reported that his 9-year-old daughter says that in elementary school, AI is now used as a pejorative. If someone says something crazy, the kids say, that's so AI. And so, more of that, please.
I'll say, I do have, as I was thinking about it, I do have one thing maybe that could work. So, most young people maybe get their news from streaming vertical video, YouTube or whatnot. But there are some tens of millions of Americans who rely on traditional news. And one major problem is just the complete collapse of traditional news in localities. Local newspapers are basically disappearing. If I were a wealthy liberal with a lot of money to burn, instead of dropping $50 million on some PAC to try to post things on Instagram, I would seed partisan newspapers. Old American tradition of partisan newspapers, hand in some swing districts, just start a newspaper, and most of what that newspaper will do is regular news gathering for the local area, but then also there will be stuff that is slanted to the Democratic Party, interviews with candidates that are very positive, that kind of thing. That these partisan newspapers would be political. They would not be. It would be partisan. They wouldn't be traditional journalism in any kind of meaningful sense. But if they provided a useful service, just letting people know what's happening in their communities, that is the beginnings of trying to stitch together connections to ordinary people in the same way that partisan newspapers were used to do in the 19th century. And maybe this just reflects the fact that I'm a big nerd. But I do think that there are lessons to take from the mass politics of the 19th century, where information environments were utterly polluted with nonsense, right? Where there was mobs and there was chaos. There's something to learn from how political parties and politicians maneuvered 19th century politics that I think can actually translate to our environment today. But it would require the people with money to just be more creative about how they spend it, and less precious about it, which is hard to tell a very wealthy person, don't worry too much about where the money's going. But I think this is for 100 millionaires and billionaires who care about democracy, this is actually a time where you say, here's 50 mil, and just see what you do with it.
All right. So unfortunately, we run out of time, but the conversation's not over. Right outside this wall, in front of the statue of George Washington, the conversation will continue over drinks and appetizers. I want to thank you all for coming today, and please join me in thanking Jamelle Bouie and Rob Mickey. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.